I also want to thank our members very much. And I'd like to thank Bank of America because it's their art and communities collection, their program that allows for these kinds of opportunities. It's very difficult to obtain a Matisse exhibition. All 4 of these books come from their collection, so we're really thrilled. What I love about my job here is that I get to be a generalist, so I get to work on contemporary art exhibitions. I did the costume show last summer. I get to work in really diverse fields. I love decorative arts and design too. But where my work really has centered personally is on European modernism. And not everyone knows exactly what modernism means, but for me the core years are really the years that Matisse embodied. He lived for so long. He was born in 1869 and he died in 1954. So think about that century that went from the beginning of the automobiles to space travel. Matisse is in those years, but really sort of the wild experimentation that happened at the turn of the last century is really exciting to me in a way that people think of the 60s as very exciting. So I guess I'm a fuddy-duddy, but I think the 20s are fabulous. Sometimes when doing press for this show, some questions that pushed back on me that I found really useful, and one of them seems so broad and general that it shouldn't have to be answered, but why is Matisse one of the most important artists of the century? And I just looked and said, there's no one answer for that. It's too complicated. We're looking at him from our perspective of things that were once really radical seeming very beautiful to us today, and we've bought many calendars and collections of note cards from museum gift shops. What I want to do is put Matisse back into his own time period today and really take him decade by decade because it's a much more nuanced history. And these artists' books are such a great way to do that because they are the culmination of his career. And rather than being a concession, you know, are we sad we don't have paintings? Yes, we love his paintings. But I myself never knew how exciting these books are. So I should start with what an artist's book is, because we all have beautiful coffee table books at home. And an artist's book is truly an artwork in its own right. Because the artist makes every creative decision from the paper to the typography to the, the layout and balance and everything that makes these luxury objects beautiful is what the artist intended. And also the choice of the authors and the subject matter that they respond to. And so these were sold in galleries. They're a luxury object in the sense that they were rather expensive, but there may have been, let's say, 250 of them issued. So it's not quite as exclusive as an individual painting. So we'll start with Matisse. This is him looking very young, working hard. He can be on a ladder at this point. We'll have to remember that later. And he had started out as a law student, as I think we've heard that story before with various artists. But he gave up the law. He came from the north of France. He moved to Paris. And he instead enrolled in the Académie Julienne with Bouguereau. And if you don't know Bouguereau, he makes, very academic woodland goat herders, females. Then Matisse tried and failed a time or two, and he was finally accepted to the École des Beaux-Arts. And he worked in the studio of Gustave Moreau, who you see here, who's a really interesting character, difficult to characterize, because he's just a wild symbolist. So what he really brought, as we'll see later, he is the father of the Fauves. And he taught his students to think outside the box, just as you can see he himself did. Here's another example. So Matisse is a young man, a young art student in Paris at the time when the 1890s, when Cézanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin and those post-impressionists are really shaking things up, but are mostly seen in galleries. And here's the kind of student work that Matisse was doing, because when you go to the École des Beaux-Arts, you're being taught to make dependable, realistic paintings. So his shift to this in the first century, the aughts, is really extraordinary. And I think that we think of Matisse, his greatest characteristics are line and color, and as we'll see in the next painting, a joy for life. Those are his 3 greatest characteristics. But here you can see almost how rough this painting is. This may seem completely acceptable to us today, but at the time, this portrait would have been extraordinarily ugly, and he was criticized, and he was called a wild beast. That's what the fauves mean. And so he was a leader of the fauves, which is a very difficult movement to explain. And later on, one of the other leaders was André Derain. As we'll see, later on, some of his close friends from this movement, during World War II, they took very different tacks during the war and would have falling outs. But at the time, this was just extraordinary, and Matisse was a renegade. That shift from that still life we first saw to this made him an innovator, made him on the edge, made him one of those artists pushing the envelopes beyond any comfort level. And I put this in here because we're going to come back to this idea again and again. And to go back, look at the figures dancing in the back of Joy of Life. Where that group of figures will lead will take us throughout this entire talk. So dance, this is in the Hermitage. He had a great collector, Shukin, in Moscow. So there are a number of beautiful Matisse paintings now in the Hermitage, including this. And this was its pendant. These two used to be above a staircase in Moscow. So music is the other element. I'm giving you clues to what this talk will be. Okay, so then after World War I, he's done all this amazing work. He's created this Matissean style that to us feels gorgeous. But he took a lot of risks to get there. And then he moves to the south of France, and he paints a lot of women in interiors, and he paints a lot of still lifes. And this made him a bit of an escapist. There's nothing wrong with these paintings. They're really beautiful. They feel like tapestries. But he was not innovative to the degree that he once was. And there are fascinating stories of the relationship between he and Picasso throughout their whole career. And the sparring that they did. But this period is known as sort of his downfall, and at least with the critics, because this is what was going on in Paris at the time. And Peggy Guggenheim, for example, she was never quite in the Matisse camp because he hadn't contributed to Cubism and Surrealism in particular. So he was falling a little bit behind because he was still attracted to this idea of beauty. So in 1930, this is the moment when we start to see these artist books come to the fore. He's in his 60s, and he makes a trip to Pittsburgh, of all places, to be a juror at the Carnegie Museum. And along the way, he writes to Albert Barnes, who owns 26 of his paintings, and he says, "Can I come visit?" So this is him sitting in the Barnes Foundation. And here he is confronted with his younger self, these 26 paintings of when he was really vigorous. And here's that painting in the photo in color. And he had to decide where he was going to go next. Here's the Barnes Foundation. Have any of you been to the Barnes? Either the old or the new? It's really extraordinary. So while he's there, also, Albert Barnes commissions him to fill this awkward archway with a painting of his choice. So he chooses the dance, which brings us back to that fabulous circle of figures. So originally he thought about this group, and he was going to have the figures dancing. You see how they're almost, even though he's playing with space, there's a three-dimensionality to that. They seem to be moving in a circle. He was going to have the figures dancing around those columns. But then he went to study Giotto's famous paintings in the Arena Chapel, which covered the walls, and he decided flatness was the way to go. At the same moment, in the spring of 1930, he makes a trip to Tahiti because he figures the light in the south of France is fantastic, but it's got to be even better in Tahiti. So he goes to French Polynesia, and people were asking last night, is that related to Gauguin? Of course, but not at all. It's it's decades later. I think they both had a bad time. Matisse admitted later it was just kind of okay, but he said 15 or 16 years later, the memories came back in a fresh new way. So he went to Tahiti for a few months. He brings back a few sketches, including this one. But he said to his daughter, he wrote to his daughter, I would stand in front of the easel and wouldn't know what to do. So he comes back, he's been to the Barnes, he's been to Tahiti, and he has a book contract waiting for him. And this is his first artist book. And when you start the exhibition, this is the first gallery that you'll go into. And the wall color chosen for that room is called Glamour, and it's very much of that sort of late 19th century mauve period. And from this dusky rose shade emerges some really radical things, including symbolist poetry. And symbolist poetry is supposed to be difficult. They considered themselves technicians, and they were putting words together in ways that had never been put together before to get beyond the understood meaning toward something even greater. So they're difficult to comprehend, and they're not meant to depict a thing realistically, which is perfect for Matisse because that was not his intention either. You see photos of him drawing from women in particular. We'll see a swan coming up. He always drew from nature, but he didn't want to just depict it. He wanted to depict the effect it had on him. So Mallarmé is such an interesting figure because he was a teacher, he was a poet, and every Tuesday he had every cultural figure we could name from the 19th century would come to his house and talk, including from England, Whistler, Rodin, you name it, all of the great painters. And they were having conversations, shared conversations about things like musicality in poetry or symbolism in painting. They were crossing all these boundaries. And here we see just some of these figures that he was friends with. Degas' photograph of Mallarmé with Renoir, and then Renoir's portrait of the poet. So these are the poems that Matisse chose for his first book to respond to. And I think, hopefully this looks familiar. This is Papeete on the boat backwards. You can tell this was of that same moment in Tahiti. But he's not trying to faithfully illustrate. This has nothing to do with illustration. This is about an artist's response to the poems. And in this book, most often, the illustration is meant to be encountered only after you've turned the page from what you've read. He didn't want a one-to-one relationship there. He wanted you to sort of discover it afterwards. Here's a beautiful swan. So we're going to revisit this idea too, because Matisse was always after this idea of largesse and expansion. So he takes these prints. The technique of printmaking he chose for this was very light and airy, and he intentionally moved it to the edges of the drawing. Here he is drawing that swan. And then this gets us, I had to pull out, when you go into the gallery, you'll see there's an entire wall where I pulled this piece out because I call it my fawn wall, because this fawn, Stéphane Mallarmé wrote this poem, Afternoon of a Fawn, which went on to influence other artists for decades. And it was a very vague, sort of filmy poem where a fawn wakes up and he thinks he's been dreaming, or perhaps he's been dreaming of encountering these nymphs, and he's just sort of gasping because it was such a terrific experience. And at the same time, as he's working on this book, he's creating this mural for Albert Barnes, working on increasingly large scale, and you can see just how related those figures are. So this is, we're going to try to play this. Has anyone ever seen or heard about this ballet before? Yes, okay. That's exciting to me. This is something I worked on early in my career, and it is, if I were trapped on a desert island and there were a VCR, this would be the one thing I would want with me. And it is this two-dimensional ballet that Nijinsky created. And he's sort of the third in line, because Mallarmé asked Debussy to compose a score based on Afternoon of a Faun, which he did. And then about 10, or just a handful of years later, Nijinsky choreographs a two-dimensional ballet based on Greek vase painting. So here he is as the faun with his fig leaf. And look at what a direct reference this is to Greek painting. This is another idea that's going to haunt this exhibition a little bit. And this idea of a two-dimensional ballet was really exciting to occur at the same time that Cubism was coming in. So we're going to watch just a bit so that you can hear the music too, because this is one of those great chances to see how a musician, a composer, also responds to Mallarmé. could watch that all day. But so the beauty of that, so that was the evocation of this Mallarmé's moment where did this thing happen or did it not? So then 20 years after Nijinsky, we get Matisse doing this beautiful line drawing, but the faun never goes away. And the faun is this great classical moment, and we'll return to that soon. So that was his first artist's book, and in some ways it feels a little bit safe, even though symbolist poetry itself was pretty wild. Now we're going to enter his 70s, and we're going to enter the 40s, and this is incredibly important because we're in France in World War II, and the poems of Schaal de Lyon, that seems incredibly obscure to us today. He was a French courtier. He was in line to the throne, and during the 100 Years' War, after the Battle of Agincourt, he was kidnapped by the English, and he was kept in jail for 25 years. But it was a very leisurely prison sentence, and he was writing poems about love from that sort of, chivalric era that was really extraordinarily refined and very French, we could say. So Matisse created this profile of him based on these portraits that he saw of relatives, close relatives of Schaal de Lyon. And he said that you can see the nose is very much the same. He said it came from sort of a poisoned personality. But why is Matisse reading Schaal de Lyon? In the very beginning of the 40s, he has stomach cancer surgery, and then he has some pulmonary embolisms, and he just, he's confined at this point. He nearly dies, and he's confined to his bed, in large part, or a wheelchair. So what he's doing is reading poetry in the morning, and that was how he said he would jump out of bed in the morning, and as people would normally take a breath of fresh air, perhaps outside, he would read poems. And he became obsessed with the poems of Schaal de Lyon, and he would read them for an hour, he was handwriting them for an hour, and then he would just move the pages around in front of him on his desk for an hour. But again, why? Because this was World War II, and to choose Schaal de Lyon was this very subtle, elegant form of protest because he was so French. And as Louis Aragon said, Matisse's use of Schaal de Lyon was a brilliant protest in the name of our country. And Claude Debussy, if you listen to our tap tour, which I hope you will, you can even access it at home on your computer, I put 3 songs. Debussy also scored 3 songs based on French Renaissance, in the style of French Renaissance music, of Schaal de Lyon's poems. So they're all coming to him at this moment. And Debussy himself said, "May we all shelter under the patronage of him, sweet prince, beloved of the muses, and so excellently French." So this idea of beauty as protest I find really interesting because whereas the beauty of Matisse's paintings in the 30s was considered outdated and too safe, it now becomes as history changes around it, that beauty and that very refined elegance of Matisse, his very Frenchness, becomes this active form of protest. Because so many of the artists benefited our post-war 30s and 40s American art scene because so many artists from Europe emigrated, had to, but Matisse and Picasso stayed, and they knew the other person stayed. And Matisse was in the south of France, Picasso was, wherever he was, moving around. And the 2 of them became national treasures for this. So during the war, Matisse reconnects with this gentleman in the photo named Rouvert, who had been a friend of his from Gustave Moreau's studio. And he sent him a book of this poetry, and he would read it in the morning, and then he would write 1 or 2 or 3 letters to his friend Rouvert every day. And he was decorating them the way we would decorate these for our friends. And sometimes he didn't have anything new to report. It was the second letter of the day, so he would just send a poem of Schaal de Lyon. And this worked its way through Rouvert's feedback into this book. So here's the same poem we just saw written as a letter. And then here it is in this book. And this is so loose and so intimate. Matisse created this with children's crayons. So even though these are color reproductions, the originals were done in crayons. And this gets back at the idea of musicality too, beyond even Debussy setting these poems to music. These were meant to originally be sung. This is the era when courtly chivalric poets would be singing these poems, so they're already really beautifully musical. And this Fleur de Lis that you'll see repeated over and over and over, this is a very French sort of, a standard, what would be on their standard. And it reminds me of this beautiful firmament of Fleur de Lis and this beautiful, what we would call both a very French blue and a Matissian blue in Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. These rabbits are very familiar. This made sense to me. You'll see in the book that some of the images are just portraits of women that don't seem to really fit in this medieval manuscript, but this is based on this tradition of these hunting images. These rabbits are very close to this French medieval manuscript. Then for me, this is another example. This is the second time. You'll see in the first gallery I've put one of our bronze fawns from the 19th century in there. But here I've put two small pages. You have to look for them because they were meant to be, kept in a pocket from a book of hours. But this idea that books were handwritten at this period, that the idea that Matisse is treating this automatic writing as a kind of plastic calligraphy just for his own personal joy is also this act of writing them out. That's how books used to be made. And there's something incredibly loose and doodle-like and fresh about the marginalia in this one that really resonates with his own looseness. This is an image that I found. It's, I can't remember the artist that's having him do the light, but you can see him at work on this very book in his bed. And he started this, all of the publication dates in the exhibition are going to be a bit misleading because he would come to this again and again. He would work on this for a couple of years, put it aside, work on it for a couple of years. And remember that he was working on this book overlapping with his work on jazz. And those are the two books that have handwriting instead of typography. So it was a difficult project. There was a bit of a lag. He finished it in 1947, but it didn't get published until 1950 by his great friend. He had a relationship since 1929 with Thériade, who was a Greek. This is a French version of his name. He was a very important publisher. Then we get to the third book. And I have to tell you, part of my job in this exhibition was to unpack what these complicated titles mean for people. And this, Pasiphae, Chant de Minos, what does that even mean? Well, it's kind of exciting. Pasiphae was the mother of the Minotaur, and this is the one contemporary writer that Matisse worked with of these four. And de Montherlant sat for a portrait by Matisse in 1940 and asked Matisse to work on a project with him. So he started thinking about this in 1940, 41, and then he picked it up for 10 solid months in 1943, because what this contemporary writer had done was readdress the birth of the Minotaur, not the labyrinth where he's eating all of the sacrifices, but the birth of the Minotaur, which comes from a really awkward love story where Pasiphae is married to King Minos, and Poseidon sends this beautiful white bull down to be sacrificed, but Minos can't bring himself to sacrifice him, so the gods, in retaliation, they put a spell on Pasiphae and compel her to desire the bull. So the old figure Daedalus, which you remember from the Icarus story, he constructs a false bull for her to get inside, and this is how the Minotaur was conceived. At the very same moment that Matisse is working on this, Jackson Pollock is also looking at this myth in a very different way, very different place. And you can see just how frenetic this is, how sort of brutal. But Matisse's view is very different. He turns this into a refined, hard to explain, impossible, almost love story. So there's Pasiphae feeling the compulsion. Here's the bull with all of his talents. And then this is this image of what it says is anguish in large, it just engages, it amasses in your throat, is what the French, he would always pull out a little bit of French and show you what he's illustrating in this case. And Matisse used to blindfold himself and work on etchings so that he could perfect this craft. And he was at the height of his powers. That automatic writing that he was doing, writing these poems, that was all part of his drawing exercises. So he could do this kind of an anguished cry in one simple, perfect line. And he made a very concerted choice in this book to go back to what looks like black figure painting, where the incised line. So instead of, this is a linocut and it's soft, and normally you would carve big sections away and you just have one line carry the ink. Well, he reversed it and treated it like an engraving so that he could just have his beautiful flourished lines. And it also recalls that ancient Greek black figure painting. This is what he was creating in order to plan the book. This is a maquette where he's cutting and pasting. You can see he's drawing an arrow to move things over. This is how he creates the visual effect of where he wants these parts to go. I love these, even just these basic sparkles. They feel like the sensation of love and excitement. And when you go on the exhibition, you'll see that I included some Greek vessels of our own, which might seem a little off-putting at first, but I want you to look back and forth because those Greek painted vases and other vessels feel incredibly modern, and they come to life in a new way. They're extremely loose. Some of them feel like the Schaal de Lyon drawings. I want you to look back and forth and think about both the constraints that both of these formats require of someone to create an image, either in a book or on those shapes, but also the ancient world that we first visited with the faun. These ideas keep coming back and back. And there are even some thoughts that the Renaissance music had its origins in ancient Greek music. So there's a spectrum of art history that keeps flickering in and out in this exhibition. And if you come back, I hope you will, on September 26th, we have Dr. Jeff Purcell's coming from USC to talk about Renaissance French literature and music, so that's really exciting. And now we get to the cutouts, where I think everybody thought this exhibition really was going to showcase, and that is where I end the exhibition because that is the most exuberant burst. But it's also, there are so many interesting stories to tell before we get here, and so many of them are overlapping with his work on jazz. So we know that you can see him in his wheelchair here, and he found a new way to work, which is to paint Linnell brand gouache on paper, cut the paper himself, and then ask his assistants to pin it to the wall. So he created this installation art. And he started using, there was a origin story to these cutouts, even though they got more beautiful later on. They began with his work in, for example, this cover for Verve was one of those art journals of the time. There's a cover. And he's working with, again, the descendants of the original Ballet Russe, the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. When he was when he was in France, he rented a garage to work on that giant dance mural. And choreographer Massin came to visit him, and Massin had already had an idea to make a mural-like ballet. And he looked at what Matisse was doing, and he said he was as much a part of this ballet as the composer or choreographer. So these are his first tryouts, sort of maquettes for what would be here the curtain for the ballet. And also he knew he wanted white, tight leotards on the figures. It was a very difficult dance. He watched the dancers move, and then after he was done, he would draw where he wanted these wing-like forms to be. And then there would be cutout fabric appliques added later. Look back at the finished mural and then what Massin did, how he incorporated the very same arches. And then here, the finished costumes by Matisse. So then he uses this So what is jazz? This portfolio is the closest he could do to recover the beauty of those Linnell brand paints and those giant cutouts. So he uses a printmaking technique called pochoir, which is based on stencils, so you could have a crisp outline. And then instead of rolling the ink on, you paint it on. So this is as close as he could get, but he was always worried that it was never going to be. Sometimes he called these After Effects cadavers because he was worried that they just wouldn't live up to the originals. But when jazz appeared, everyone just loved it. This was a wild success. So here this says Cirque, which is circus. That was his original title for this book. And there is nothing in the book that has anything to do with jazz. They're all circus and lost memories. This is Monsieur Loyal, there was an original Monsieur Loyal ages ago, and then he became the standard name for ringmaster, a circus ringmaster. This knife thrower, incredibly beautiful. Look at the hot pink knife thrower. I mean, what a genius to be able to capture that movement of throwing in that bizarre shape, and then that almost heart cover on the female. This cowboy, these are two primordial forces engaged in battle. And they don't really resemble a cowboy or a bull, but yet they do. This is one of my favorites because when Matisse was working so hard as a draftsman, he would compare himself to an acrobat or an aerialist who didn't have to think when they crossed a tightrope or when they were doing a catch. He wanted to draw, so that when he did it, like that single line image, he could just do it. So this is also a famous troupe of aerialists. It was a family legacy. They derived from Mexico, but they were performing in North America and Europe, including Paris. There were films made of them. There were extras in the movie Tarzan, for example. They had wild tragedies and romances, so they were in the news. And I wanted to show these comparison of what that catch was like in the air and then that static moment between the two figures during the catch. And then the beautiful way that he created a net below. This is a typo. It should be Kodana, not Kodama, so that makes me feel better about my typos. So the question is, why was this called jazz? Matisse never intended it to be called jazz, but in his correspondence with his publisher, the publisher kept calling it jazz. And finally, in 1944, Matisse conceded. And I think it's such an interesting question because, yes, afterwards, Matisse and others said, well, it's about improvisation and syncopation. And it's true that when he had the pages of text, they were meant to be a certain ratio of those to the ratio of images or 1 to a half-page image. So people have called that a syncopation, and I think that's true. But there's something beyond that, which is what did jazz mean during World War II? And when this book was commissioned, the publisher said, I want to create a book of Matisse's color. And also, what would that mean? This is the subtle and becoming not so subtle protest that we talked about with Schaal de Lyon. And jazz itself was a form of protest. And there was a popular youth front called the Zazu, which we might compare to punks today. They had a certain brand of clothing like this, very, very tall hair, very big suits, a la Cab Calloway. They had to wear plaid, the women carried umbrellas, and they literally, they were battling with the Nazi youth front that would come in and try to cut their hair or round them up. At times, there were even yellow stars that said Zazu that were worn in solidarity with the Jews who had to wear their indicator. So this youth front was really, really a powerful resistance, very visual. You could tell from their clothing. And their music was swing and jazz. But especially after we joined the war in 1941, jazz was forbidden because it had been brought by us and our African-American soldiers with World War I and become popular. But after we joined the war, the Germans really wanted nothing to do with it. Nor did they want anything to do with Matisse, too. They would say, into the ash can with Matisse. And And so these things were degenerate and foreign. And so the French created, and this is the era of Django Reinhardt, who himself escaped. He was a gypsy, and yet he escaped, and was able to create jazz clubs, and these jazz clubs also transferred messages, and they created a false creation myth for how jazz started. And it started in France with Debussy. So that's our third mention of Debussy. It obviously didn't, but they wanted to fool the Germans so that they could listen to it. And the Germans were fooled enough that they would play it before and after their propaganda programs, thinking that the French would listen to it and take it in. So it's a really interesting, creative protest. Here's a dictionary of how to look like a Zazu. And like I say, Matisse is still working. His estranged wife, they were separated at the time, but also his son and daughter were active resistance fighters, to the point of being captured by the Gestapo. So this is not a false equivalent. He is ill in his 70s, recovering in the south of France, worried about his family that he knows have been captured, but he doesn't know what's happening with them. So his form of protest was to remain Matisse and to use beauty as a form of protest. And that is why I think jazz is such a phenomenal name for this work that approaches. When Matisse had these surgeries, the Dominican nuns that took care of him called him the risen one. He was supposed to be dead. So he thought of himself as living on borrowed time, and he called this a second life. And what this impact is, he's moving closer to abstraction than he ever has before. His work is becoming bigger than it ever has before. And all of this is expressed in this portfolio. The idea of the flatness of space but the expansiveness comes from two ideas. And I should say that the text that he's putting in here, this is not him responding to another author. This is him writing sort of deep thoughts by Matisse, but they're not really, they're sort of decorative. They're not meant to be, they're not poems, they're reflections. Here he's remembering the feeling of flying in an airplane, which is a great evocation to have next to this idea of Icarus falling from the sky. The other vast sense of space that I think he's opening up onto, he remembered, this is where he said that his trip to Tahiti started to feel pretty good, because he was remembering swimming under the sea and just the vastness of that, and then re-emerging from the surface and the wholeness that he experienced there. So there are several images of these seaweed forms which are getting at that totality. And then the final, so this was published in 1947. He'd worked on it for years. He passed away in 1954, but at the very end, I think where we can see this portfolio lifting off even further, is the idea that light passed through. So he built what's known, nicknamed the Matisse Chapel. It's a Dominican chapel in the south of France, where he designed all of the windows, the mosaics, and even the church vestments. So they don't look too far off from his ballet costumes we saw. And I'm going to end here just because it seems like an apotheosis of Matisse. But yeah, I think I'm just going to end there with the apotheosis of Matisse. What I've done in the jazz gallery is include 20 songs from their swing and ragtime and jazz from World War II France, so that you can take in both the visual and the experiential. It also feels very French. So I hope you enjoy that. And thank you so much for coming today.